Have you ever wondered where Cain's wife came from? If Adam and Eve were the first humans, and their sons were Cain and Abel, then how did Cain find a woman to marry? This question has intrigued scholars, theologians, and curious people for centuries. The Bible mentions that Cain married and had descendants, but does not directly reveal who his wife was. This raises countless questions and theories, some controversial, others surprisingly logical. Were there other human lineages besides that of Adam and Eve? Or is the answer right in front of our eyes, and we simply never see it? In this video, we will explore what the Bible really says, unravel mysteries of Genesis, and analyze how this story connects with the origin of humanity. Get ready for a journey of discovery, because the truth can be much more impactful than you imagine. Since the beginning, humanity has always questioned its origins. The Bible answers this question right at the beginning, in the book of Genesis, by reporting that God created Adam and Eve as the first human beings. They were shaped in the image and likeness of the Creator, with a clear purpose, to dominate the earth and multiply. Unlike any other creation, they received something special, the breath of life directly from God, making them unique among all creatures. By placing them in the Garden of Eden, God established a perfect model for humanity. A place without pain, suffering, or sin, where everything was in harmony. But along with this blessing also came a responsibility, obeying divine instructions. The goal was clear: to multiply, populate the earth, and spread God's goodness and wisdom to future generations. The initial plan was perfect, but free will would play a crucial role in this story. The issue of multiplying humanity was essential, and that is why Adam and Eve received the mission of generating children. Genesis does not detail how many descendants they had, but it mentions Cain, Abel, and Seth, as well as many other sons and daughters. In other words, population growth followed a divine plan. In the beginning, marriage between close relatives was not a problem, as humanity still had pure DNA, without the genetic risks we know today. However, history did not follow the perfect path. Sin entered the world, and with it came the fall of humanity. What was supposed to be a journey of harmonious growth and expansion has become a battle between good and evil. God's creation was affected, and this would result in consequences that would shape all of human history, including the fate of Cain and his mysterious wife. One of the most intriguing questions in the Bible is, who was Cain's wife? If Adam and Eve were the first human beings, how did Cain find someone to marry? This doubt has generated countless theories and debates throughout history. However, when we analyze the biblical account carefully, we realize that the answer may be closer than we imagine. The book of Genesis 5:4 gives us an important clue by mentioning that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters besides Cain, Abel, and Seth. This indicates that, at the beginning of humanity, the children of Adam and Eve married each other to ensure the multiplication of the human race. At that time, there was no other option other than marriage between siblings or very close relatives. Although this seems unthinkable today, in the beginning of creation, it was part of the divine plan for humanity's growth. The Bible does not directly mention the name of Cain's wife, but taking into account that there were no other human lineages outside of the descent of Adam and Eve, the only logical possibility is that she was his own sister or niece. This type of union was acceptable at that time because human genetics were still pure, without the problems of mutations and diseases that we associate with consanguineous marriage today. This revelation may seem shocking to many people today, but it is essential to understand the biblical and historical context. In the beginning, humanity was just beginning, and certain rules that we know today had not yet been established. But as time passed, God brought more specific directions about relationships and marriages, which shows that divine revelation was progressive throughout history. The Bible, despite not providing explicit details about Cain's wife, gives valuable clues that help us understand this issue. In Genesis 5:4, it is written that Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, which indicates that there were more people on earth than Cain, Abel, and Seth. This information is essential, as it confirms that humanity grew within the same lineage, and the first marriages took place between brothers and close relatives. In the context of Genesis, this practice was not seen as something wrong or prohibited. God had given the order for humanity to multiply and populate the earth, Genesis 1:28. As there were no other families yet, the only way to fulfill this commandment was marriage between direct descendants of Adam and Eve. In this scenario, marriage between siblings was not a problem, as creation was recent and genetic risks did not yet exist. It is interesting to note that the Bible is not concerned with reporting every name or detail about the first descendants of Adam and Eve. This is because the main focus of the biblical account is not to give a complete genealogical list, but rather to show the history of humanity from the perspective of man's relationship with God. Cain and his descendants stand out because their sin brought serious consequences to history, while Seth's lineage represents those who remained faithful to the Creator. Therefore, when we analyze the biblical records, we realize that the answer to the mystery of Cain's wife lies in the sacred text itself. He shows us a time when the rules we know today had not yet been established, and God allowed marriage between relatives to guarantee the multiplication of humanity. But as history took its course, this practice would be revised and prohibited by God, which brings us to the next important point in our analysis. To understand why marriage between siblings was permitted at the beginning of humanity, it is essential to consider the genetic issue. Today, we know that consanguineous unions increase the risk of harmful genetic mutations. However, in the times of Adam and Eve, human DNA was pure, without the imperfections accumulated over generations. This means that their children did not have the genetic mutations that today make intermarriage a biological danger. Science shows us that over time, random mutations occur in the genetic code, many of which have negative effects. In the beginning, however, the human genetic code was perfect, as it was created directly by God. Marriage between close relatives, such as brothers or nephews, did not generate health problems or deformities. This factor explains why God allowed this practice in the first centuries of humanity, but also why He prohibited it later, when genetic risks began to become significant. This principle makes sense from a biblical perspective. God created man and woman in His image and likeness, and their genetics were impeccable. As generations passed and sin spread throughout the world, the corruption of the human body intensified, leading to diseases and genetic weaknesses. It was in this context that purity laws and the prohibition of incest were later introduced, guaranteeing the protection of humanity against hereditary diseases. Therefore, when we analyze the issue of marriage between relatives at the beginning of humanity, we see that it was not a mistake or contradiction, but a carefully structured plan. God allowed this practice temporarily for the multiplication of humanity, but as time passed and the risks increased, He established new rules to protect society. This process is part of the progressive revelation of God's will, which unfolds throughout the Scriptures. With the advancement of humanity, God began to establish more specific laws to regulate the social and moral life of the people. Among these directions came the prohibition of marriage between close relatives, something that was initially permitted, but which, over time, became unacceptable from both a moral and biological point of view. This change is a clear example of God's progressive revelation, where He adapts His laws according to humanity's needs. The prohibition of incest appears explicitly in Leviticus 18:6, where God orders that no man should approach a close relative to have intimate relations. This commandment was given long after creation, when the people of Israel were already being formed and needed clear laws to organize their society. The reason for this prohibition was not only moral, but also genetic and social. As genetic mutations accumulated over generations, the risks of hereditary diseases increased, making consanguineous marriage dangerous. In addition to the biological issue, incest also brought social and emotional problems, generating family disputes and conflicts that destroyed the structure of ancient societies. Biblical history shows several cases of incest that resulted in tragedies, such as the relationship between Lot and his daughters, Genesis 19:30-38, which gave rise to peoples who were enemies of Israel. This demonstrates how when God sets a limit, it is because he knows the long-term consequences. Therefore, the prohibition of incest was not a contradiction, but a natural evolution of divine legislation. In the beginning, when humanity was in its initial phase, there was no genetic risk or moral corruption in this type of union. But as time passed and the effects of sin spread, God, in his wisdom, adjusted the laws to protect humanity. This process reinforces a fundamental principle. God's commandments are not random, but always seek to preserve the life and well-being of human beings. Sin always has consequences, and the story of Cain is one of the most striking proofs of this. After killing his brother Abel out of envy and anger, Cain not only became humanity's first murderer, but was also cursed by God and expelled from the divine presence. This act broke his connection with the righteous lineage of Adam and Eve, and his descendants followed a path increasingly distant from God's plans. Cain's punishment was severe, but it was not a death sentence. God declared that he would become a wanderer on earth, and placed a sign on him to protect him from the vengeance of other descendants of Adam. This detail is curious, as it suggests that there were already other people on earth, reinforcing the idea that Adam and Eve had many children and that humanity was already multiplying. Even away from his family and the divine presence, Cain found a wife and founded the first city recorded in the Bible, called Enoch, named in honor of his son. From that point on, Cain's descendants moved further and further away from divine principles, building a civilization marked by human development, but also by moral decadence. His great-great-grandson, Lamech, was the first man to practice polygamy, and also the first to be proud of murder, demonstrating how violence became a pattern in his lineage. Meanwhile, the family of Seth, another son of Adam, followed a different path, maintaining faith and worship of the Creator. The story of Cain and his descendants is a portrait of the impact of sin on humanity. The desire to move away from God led his lineage to follow a path of self-sufficiency, pride and violence, contrasting with the lineage of the righteous that would come from Seth. This pattern of choices and consequences was not restricted to the past, but continues to be repeated in the history of humanity to this day. While Cain and his descendants followed a path away from God, Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, who became the ancestor of a lineage marked by faith and obedience to the Creator. In Genesis 4:26, it is said that, from Seth, people began to call on the name of the Lord, indicating the emergence of a righteous and God-fearing lineage. From this offspring came great men of faith, such as Enoch, who walked with God and was caught up without seeing death, and Noah, the only righteous person found in his generation, chosen to preserve humanity from the flood. Unlike Cain's lineage, which dedicated itself to building cities and developing human culture, Seth's descendants were more concerned with communion with God and preserving true worship. This separation between the two lineages became even more evident in the times of Noah, when humanity's corruption and evil reached unsustainable levels. The Bible suggests that when the descendants of Seth began to mix with the descendants of Cain, there was a great moral degradation, resulting in the destruction of the ancient world by the flood. Only Noah and his family were spared, ensuring the continuity of the lineage of the righteous. The story of the lineage of Seth shows us that there has always been a faithful remnant, a group of people who chose to remain close to God, even when the world around them was heading towards chaos. This idea is repeated throughout the scriptures and reminds us that, regardless of the circumstances, God always preserves those who choose to follow him. And from this lineage, centuries later, Abraham, Israel, and finally Christ himself would emerge, bringing salvation to all humanity. God never revealed all of his laws and plans at once. Instead, he adjusted his guidelines as humanity developed and its needs changed. This concept is called progressive revelation, and we can see it clearly in the issue of sibling marriage at the beginning of humanity. What was permitted in the times of Adam and Eve was later prohibited, not out of contradiction, but because the conditions of humanity had changed. In the beginning, as human DNA was pure and humanity needed to multiply, marriage between close relatives was a necessity, and there were no genetic or moral risks. But as the centuries passed and sin increasingly corrupted man, God established laws to protect the health and morality of his people. This is how, in Leviticus 18, he determined the prohibition of incest, ensuring that future generations would not suffer from genetic problems and social disorders. This pattern of changing divine guidance can be seen in other areas of the Bible. For example, before the flood, men lived hundreds of years, but then God reduced their life expectancy, Genesis 6:3. Another example is in food. In Eden, human beings were vegetarians, but after the flood, God allowed the consumption of meat, Genesis 9:3. These changes show how God adapts his laws to protect humanity according to each period of history. The concept of progressive revelation teaches us that God always has a plan, even when certain changes may seem contradictory at first glance. He guides humanity according to their spiritual maturity and needs. Thus, what began with sibling marriage in Genesis was later replaced by a model of marriage that reflects sanctity, protection, and stability for society. As humanity advanced and multiplied, the consequences of marriage between relatives began to emerge, both from a genetic and social point of view. What was once a necessity for the survival of the species now represents a risk. The degradation of human DNA, with the accumulation of mutations over generations, has made consanguineous marriages biologically dangerous, resulting in hereditary diseases and physical weaknesses. Furthermore, the social impacts of incest have become evident. The Bible presents examples in which relationships between relatives brought disorder and suffering. The case of Lot's daughters, who had children with their own father after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, resulted in the formation of the Moabite and Ammonite peoples, nations that would later be enemies of Israel. Genesis 19:30-38. Another example is the story of Amnon and Tamar, half-brothers, where uncontrolled desire led to tragedy and murder within the house of David, 2 Samuel 13. Moral degradation was also a determining factor in God definitively prohibiting incest. Humanity no longer possessed the innocence of the times of Adam and Eve, and relationships within the family began to generate conflicts, destruction of bonds, and abuse. Divine legislation, recorded in Leviticus 186, came to establish clear limits and prevent the corruption of the flesh from affecting the family and social structure. This development reinforces an essential principle. God does not change, but his directions are given as humanity evolves. The impact of incest throughout history has shown that the prohibition was not just an arbitrary rule, but a real necessity to protect life and morality. With this, God established a new standard for relationships, promoting healthy marriages and ensuring the continuity of humanity within a divinely ordained model. In the Christian view, marriage is a sacred institution created by God to reflect the perfect union between Christ and his church. Since Old Testament times, God has guided humanity to a marriage model based on purity, commitment, and building a healthy family. The prohibition of incest was part of this development, ensuring that family ties were preserved and that relationships were built on solid moral foundations. In the New Testament, Jesus reinforces the importance of marriage when he says that a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, Matthew 19:5. This demonstrates that the divine plan did not involve long-term marriages within the same family, but rather the formation of new family units. Incest, in addition to generating conflicts and genetic weaknesses, also undermines the original purpose of marriage, which is a healthy union between a man and a woman, without compromising family harmony. The Bible presents several examples of how disordered relationships brought suffering. In contrast, characters who followed God's principles for marriage were blessed and had strong offspring. This pattern extends to Christ's promise to the church, where he presents himself as the perfect bridegroom who cares for and protects his people. Thus, Christian marriage is much more than a legal union. It is a reflection of faithfulness and divine love. The story of Cain's wife and the issue of marriage between brothers show us how God works progressively, guiding humanity until achieving his full will. What began as a necessity at the beginning of creation was later adjusted to reflect the principles of holiness and balance that God desires for his creatures. This teaching reinforces the importance of always seeking divine guidance in all areas of life, especially when building our families. The story of Cain and his wife takes us on a fascinating journey through Genesis, revealing truths that often go unnoticed. Sibling marriage, which was initially permitted by God to ensure the multiplication of humanity, later became both a biological and a moral problem. But, far from being a contradiction, this change demonstrates how God leads the history of humanity in a progressive manner, always aiming for the good of his creatures. Throughout Scripture, we see that every choice has consequences. Cain's lineage followed a path away from God, while Seth's lineage remained faithful, culminating in the descendants that would bring Noah, Abraham, and finally Jesus Christ. This narrative shows us that the decisions we make shape not only our lives, but also the future of the generations that come after us. And you, have you ever thought about this story from this perspective? How do these revelations change your view of God's plan for humanity? Leave your comment and share your opinion. And if you want to continue discovering the hidden mysteries of the Bible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we are just beginning to unlock the secrets that God's Word has to reveal.